Shift Happens Podcast.
Welcome to the Shift Happens Podcast, where we explore the latest trends and technologies transforming the future of work. Today, we're joined by Jon Reed, co-founder of Diginomica, a respected voice in enterprise technology. Jon brings decades of experience covering technology transformations and offers an enterprise AI reality check, insights on data quality and security considerations, and some compelling examples of successful AI implementation. Let's get started. First of all, Jon, I've been following you for years and love your work, love everything, your insights, and to get the conversation going, I ask a lot of our guests. The first question I ask is, what song resonates with you as you think about disruption, change, and transformation? And why'd you pick that song? Because all of us have some songs that we like.
Yeah, so this one takes me way back to Rush's Spirit of Radio, which is, well, why would you go back into the 80s for the song? But the lyrical bit that jumps out at me from that song that always stuck with me to this day is, all this machinery making modern music can still be open-hearted, not so coldly charted. It's really just a question of your honesty. Yeah, your honesty. And I think that really kind of sums up to me a lot of my philosophy about technology, that it's something that we have to take some kind of creative ownership of and make sure we influence in a way that makes lives better. And then, of course, the next little stanza comes with a little bit of a warning, which says, one likes to believe in the freedom of music, but glittering prizes and endless compromises shadow the illusion of integrity. And that also, I think, kind of jumps out a little bit in the sense that there's an edge a lot of times to technology, and we certainly see that in the context of AI. And so we need to also be aware of that things come with a little bit of a kick as well. And so that's always really framed the thing for me. And it's just, there's a lot of other music that I like, but that really captures to me like what I'm personally trying to aspire to, I guess. So.
I distinctly remember this song. So when you shared it, I remember the very first line, right? I had to look it up again because it's been years since I heard this song. It says, "Begin the day with a friendly voice." I mean, to me, that's so powerful because it still talks about the human element in anything and everything, right? And sometimes, even literally, what do I begin with? I see emails, I see chats, I see social media posts. And in some ways, it's good. I get updated, but I miss that human interaction and then that human voice to everything we do.
Yeah, and I think if we have that as a little bit of that guiding principle, I think we can accomplish some things and make sure that we infuse humanity in our work and in our personal lives as well. So anyway, I derived some inspiration from that. So that was a good challenge for me to think of the right song. So thanks for that. I don't get asked that question all the time. So
yeah, because I don't know. There's two things in life, right? Food and music. Everybody has something that they like and they love, right? And food, we can get into debates about, but music, everybody seems to agree on music. So look, thank you for being here in this show. Our listeners, I'm sure a lot of them know you, read a lot of your work. So maybe let's start with your journey into covering technology. I've been following you for years. I've read a lot of your work, your insights, and in fact, even some predictions. So how would you say, in a nutshell, in the last, I would say, even 3 years post-pandemic, technology has evolved in your feelings about the hype with AI? I just read, by the way, I caught up with your recent article on AI skepticism. So maybe we can end there. How did it begin and why you think there's a lot of skepticism these days?
Yeah, so I think post-pandemic was interesting because I do think there was a little bit of a sense that after the pandemic, we would return to some kind of normalcy, quote unquote. But I think it's actually not really been that way at all, in both good and bad ways. And the pandemic really, really, really forced a lot of organizations and individuals to adapt a lot of the things that they had been doing. And there was a real push towards modernization, especially around collaboration tools and cloud. And I don't think we realized at that time there was a little bit of an artificial inflation expansion in sort of software spending as a result of that. There was sort of like an urgency. There was a little more government support, perhaps, of individual. And so then we get into a post-pandemic time that feels pretty, trying to get a good word for it, maybe Darwinian. It feels like very hardcore. It feels like there's a lot of macroeconomic factors and headwinds, whether you want to talk about global conflicts or continued supply chain disruptions. There's a backdrop of conditions for companies that have global reverberations and implications that feel like a challenging environment to navigate. And then in the midst of all that, obviously we've had a real surge on the AI front with sort of like, I guess you could say, the popularization of some AI technologies, because AI was obviously still a factor during the pandemic times, but I think I've had Alexa devices for God knows how many years now, right? But there was this acceleration based on the popularization of generative AI through ChatGPT and all the things that sort of has invoked and now somewhat with the rise of AI agents. But at the same time, there's sort of like two aspects of that to think about, which is one, that didn't necessarily mean that budgets expanded again to include all of the scope of like, let's spend a ton of money and just see how it goes. So AI has been treated by companies as like, yes, we have to look at this, but not with this sort of extravagant gold rush spending. And when you look at the companies that are having a gold rush experience, it's primarily the ones that are selling the shovels for the gold rush, the NVIDIAs and the hyperscalers and stuff like that. But if you look at like leading companies in different industry sectors, whether it's retail or healthcare or whatever, they're all investing in these technologies, but they're not like, oh my gosh, we're just doing spectacularly well because of AI. And so there are, in the industry context, there's a lot of hard questions being asked. And then vendors, I have argued, are pushing a little too hard, because what they're doing right now is they're pushing technology so aggressively that they don't need to push that hard, because this is pre-sold. Like, companies want to engage around AI. And so vendors are not quite sensing the moment quite right, because what's slowing people down from engaging and buying is not that they need to be sold to, they need to be educated and understand the pros and cons. So that's kind of where I think we're at. And then, of course, there's the rise of AI agents and stuff. So there's that. So
I want to anchor on what you just said, right? Where vendors are pushing hard, technology companies are pushing hard. Would you say, okay, I'm going to say something controversial, that a lot of these industry analysts are also stroking that? Meaning, you see reports from Gartner and IDC and Canalys that, AI spending will be $250 billion. There's this many millions and billions of business opportunity. It sounds great, but at the same time, the reality is, even we're seeing ourselves or with our customers, we've invested in AI, a simple thing as Copilot. But to be honest, what are people really using it for, right? Because to your point, education, frankly, is missing. People are doing the ground level, easy things, write an email, create this document. But it's not really affecting my day-to-day work, really. I save 1 minute, maybe 3 minutes. So I think there's that gap, right? The artificial inflation of the benefits and the promise of AI that people think they'll get immediately, which I don't think it's true. But at the same time, there's this gap of education, use cases, and frankly, maturity of individuals using this too.
Yeah, I mean, you've asked the absolute right question there, and it is a little bit difficult to look at this because, yeah, you hear these massive numbers, and I'm not so sure that a lot of those numbers are wrong, but you have to be really cognizant of the fact that when you talk about, it's a $1 trillion market, it doesn't mean that those revenues are going to be distributed amongst us, like handing out $1 trillion and like, hey, here's your share of the trillion. That would be awesome. But also the timeframes are really, really important here. And the timeframes I think are perhaps a little bit longer than some of these firms have let on. And then also you hear a lot of conflicting reports. When you really drill down into what's happening now, there's a handful of use cases that I think you can say, oh yes, I can really see how this is going to work. But I don't really think it's mostly in the Copilot scenario right now. One of the reasons for that is because the Copilots that I think are going to be fairly effective in the short term are going to be very kind of specific to a role and situation. So for example, like support is one of the areas where generative AI, I think, is in a position to have some immediate impact. Now, companies are going to use it differently. I think one of the best ways is when you have really good support documentation, and data is a key here, quality of, then, you have a support person that's not necessarily being replaced, but they get up to speed. The evidence shows a lot more quickly with this documentation. They can interact with in a way that they couldn't really in the past. And we could talk a little bit about why generative AI is better than past technologies for that. But the point is, when we start using copilots, as we think about, wouldn't it be awesome to have a robotic assistant that could just help me with everything, right? Like, okay, I need to book a plane flight now. I need go book me a meeting. Go handle this issue for me. Go order my lunch. Go and there's nothing like that, and we're not anywhere close to that. And so I think copilots aren't really no offense to any of the vendors that are working on them. I don't think that's really where the action is at the moment. I think it's more, I think service and support is a big one. There's a lot of interesting stuff around the automation of processes that involve unstructured data. So for example, like a lot of talk last week, UiPath around invoice recognition and things like that, because some of the technologies for dealing with unstructured documents are really good with generative AI. So there are some areas that are promising. And of course, there's a big debate around coding and development, and there does seem to be some real benefits around development. But even that is tricky because you have to think about security and code quality, and think about the fact that a lot of senior developers don't really need these tools very much. And so anyway, it's a very interesting scenario because, like you said, you're like, wow, there's this, and I do believe eventually there is going to be like major shifts as a result of this technology in general, but it's not going to happen on the time frame of like what we're hearing, and that's a struggle to figure out how to reconcile that both individually and for your company.
There's two things you mentioned, right? And I want to highlight that. Number one, I do agree. Anything industry specific, use case specific, purpose built, like support, or even I've seen things. There's one customers we work with, they actually build a copilot for new hire onboarding. So if there's a new employee, based on, it's your third day of work, it'll just message you, hey, how are you, John? Hope you're enjoying, your third day here at AvePoint. I noticed you haven't looked at the TPS report. Can I help you with that? Or can I connect you with somebody? So those type of purpose-built AI, I think are really useful in a lot of organizations. The second thing you said three keywords. Data is key, right? A lot of organizations today and customers we work with, frankly, they're excited, which is great. They want to roll out things like enterprise-wide, like Microsoft Copilot or Gemini for Google Workspace. But one consideration that I think, especially leaders who want Gen AI in place, are really thinking hard about is, what does their data estate look like? Because, for example, let me pick 365. The way Microsoft built technology is brilliant because your data is your data. They layered in Microsoft Copilot. They can look at the 365 tenant across emails, documents, OneDrive, Teams, SharePoint, whatever, and brings back relevant information. But the assumption is your data quality is good, like you said. Because if you ask for, hey, show me the expense policy, and you have a document 20 years old, it's going to bring back document from 20 years old, right? So not going to be relevant. The second thing is data security. So in the age of oversharing information, I'm going to share this Word document, this PowerPoint file, this chat, and you can't keep track who you shared it with. So what if it brings information that you're not supposed to see? That's the other trepidation, frankly, with a lot of organizations trying to roll this out enterprise-wide. Unless, like you said, it gets smarter and it gets more capable of dealing with things like this, it's still going to take some time for full adoption across enterprise.
Right. So you've raised like two really interesting points, and I think I would say kind of a good news, bad news thing. I think the bad news part of what you said, kind of like in the challenge category, is that even with data quality being higher, there are some challenges around, for example, like we take a lot of things for granted in our data. Like a lot of times we don't even realize the manual adjustments that we make behind the scenes. And so, for example, you have a machine processing an invoice, but doesn't know that there is a special discount that still applies to this customer. So the data is perfect, right? Except for the fact that there's something that's missing that's contextual about that relationship. And that if you then automate that process, you can end up really alienating an important customer if you don't really think really hard about what you would do if there was a misunderstanding around something like that. So that's one thing is that even when you have really quality data, a lot of the context of a business relationship can be hard to really track. And you can try to get that through the unstructured documents and stuff, but there is this piece there. And then the next part is, I think a little bit on the good news side is around security. And I completely understand why customers are concerned about security. And it is true that large language models in particular present new attack vectors. And when you think about consumer LLMs, we've seen again and again that there are ways to engineer prompts and different things to pull data out of them that never was supposed to be pulled out, right? There was a recent story about the personal chats, like, that you would have around, like, I can't remember what it was, maybe therapy or whatever, you could pull that stuff out. And it depends on the model and how they operate and stuff like that. But the point is that there's stuff in there that you can pull out that you don't want. But the good news is that I do think a lot of vendors, and certainly including Microsoft and many others, are working hard on responsible AI architectures that prevent a lot of that stuff from happening. And there's a lot of different ways you can prevent it. And I've been spending a lot of time documenting all of that this year in a lot of different ways of approaching it. For example, you can have much smaller models that are custom to a particular customer, so the data never leaves. They technically still own all of that, and the data never really leaves their premise. It never goes into the large language model. And then if you use a large language model, the customer data only is manipulated through a prompt and some type of technique like retrieval augmented generation, so it never becomes part of the model set at all. And there's still some details that have to be covered with vendors around things like log files and stuff like that. But the point is, you can do it. I think where vendors have fallen short quite a bit is by not talking enough about how they do that and how they protect the data differently than a consumer model. And this is one of my big points, is you have to get into the education. Customers need to be taken under the hood, and you need to be able to walk them through. And you say, oh, that's too technical. I think you'll be surprised. I think a lot of customers really want to understand the data flow here. And I've seen it again and again when I've dug into this with vendors and gotten a good response from readers. But I explained to them, like, why did I have to push so hard for this? You should have just put this out there because this is what your customers and prospects need to know,
Absolutely. One thing with responsible AI too, I want to get your take. How much of that now has to deal with regulation and government involvement, right? Because we've seen it time and again back in the days of cybersecurity or broadband access. At some point, the government has to have a say on that. So what have you seen or observation? And unfortunately, every government's different.
Yeah, I mean, we are going to see more and more regulations. In the U.S. environment, it's really difficult to say a lot because we don't know a whole lot on what the political environment's going to be like. It's a little bit hard to say how everything's going to transpire after that. But what we saw in California was interesting because that set of regulations did not pass. I will say that the big AI organizations, although they might say a lot of things around how they support being regulated, they do a lot of lobbying around what you might say loosening some of those recommendations and regulations in various ways. And so it's a complicated picture, but the EU AI Act is clearly an important piece of legislation, and any company that has European interests will be spending time trying to understand, like, are they compliant with those regulations? And frankly, I need to take a harder look at what the final version was, because there were different iterations of this. But there's different risk levels that are associated with this, how the act regulates AI technology. So you have to start to become aware of the risk factors that are regulated according to, obviously things around, personal data and human resources, and hiring and potential discrimination are going to be big. One thing we're going to see also is the attempt to incorporate that into existing laws. So, you'll see not necessarily always specific AI regulations, but, you may see a lawsuit like that's happening around copyright, where, this, our copyright law wasn't designed to govern AI use cases, but existing copyright law is being used in some cases for lawsuits. So, I think, the best thing for companies is that you're going to need legal advice around all of this. And, you're going to need to get that based on your industry. And so there's no way in this podcast that you and I can cover that off for a company and say, you're all set. But I think a lot of it is going to come down to things like data privacy and just common sense ethical considerations around how you're using data.
It's interesting you say copyright. So this week, early this week, I was at an event in Dallas. I was attended by Warner Music Group executive, and he asked me, he's like, it's tough now, right? Between intellectual property and copyright, all these AI technologies are coming out, creating music, mashups, and whatnot. And he was asking me, as a tech company, right, how can you prevent that from happening? I go, I can't prevent that from happening. And we're in this limbo of, again, we need laws and regulation to address and figure out how to take care of that, because it's really nothing new. In the past, we had the same challenge, things like streaming services, right? When streaming services came out, whole new world for movie studios and movie theaters. Not that it's 100% resolved, but somehow they figure out a way how everybody still gets paid and monetize that too.
Yeah, and I think, I've had some arguments with my colleagues around this, because I am very, very, very much an advocate for creators being compensated by these systems, and in fact, all these systems have a great debt to the creators and human labor that went into all the training that was never compensated. But I'm a little bit skeptical of whether that will get alleviated in terms of how we got to this point. I do think going forward, we will probably start to see systems that do create compensation models for how data is trained. And, just like music and stuff, they won't be, I don't think, anywhere near perfect. Like, for example, most of the streaming services, the royalty models, I don't think are really particularly viable for most musicians to really do anything with. But at least there is an attempt to distribute based on consumption and try to make it try to put a legal framework around it. And so I do think we'll find that. I mean, the thing is that at the moment, one of the problems that these companies have is that it's been shown that you can actually pull verbatim content out of a lot of these models, or in visual models, you can pull out actual corporate logos and designs and stuff like that. And as long as that happens, there's going to be, I think, strong legal basis for actions. What these language model providers are going to try to do is shift things so that can't be pulled out, and that's going to be a real big challenge. But that's what they're going to try to do, because if they can make it so that you can't pull recognizable material out, then they can make a different argument. It's kind of a long conversation, but they can make a fair use argument that they're not, putting out verbatim stuff, and then the legal quagmire gets much more difficult to navigate. And so enterprises, I think, aren't in big trouble here, but they do need to have that discussion with their lawyers in the large language models, but I don't think in most cases, like just using a model that has like problematic material in it can get a company into trouble unless that's getting output to your customers. And so the thing is that most enterprise use cases are going to be much narrower than that. So the risk of that is very small. Like if you interact with generative AI support agents, for example, and try to get it to give you song lyrics, it's not going to go there.
No, it's certainly, again, right? It's a work in progress, and it's never going to be perfect because guess what? There's always going to be a new technology that comes out. Now, I want to pivot back. You said something earlier. You said, there's good news and bad news. So let's maybe talk about good news. In your coverage, you've talked to a lot of companies. You've seen a lot of use cases. Can you share maybe an example or two of projects or implementations of AI that are going really well, and even to the extent that you're pleasantly surprised that this is happening right now?
Right. So I would divide the good news into like a few different categories. One aspect of the good news is all the responsible AI architecture stuff that you and I talked about. I'm much more bullish actually on AI in an enterprise context than I am in the wild, so to speak. So I like that effort. The next thing is that let's not forget there's a lot of useful forms of AI that have like made lives better in certain ways. You could argue how much like delivery service like DoorDash changed our lives or whatever, but certainly rideshare has impacted a lot of people, and those are AI algorithmic systems that power those, and GPS. I think is like unquestionably valuable, and so there are in search too. Consumer search has been good historically. I'm a little queasy about generative AI search, but that's a different story. But in terms of enterprise like use cases, honestly, there haven't been as many really good ones just because a lot of companies still kind of piloting this stuff. But there were a couple good ones. One I did, it actually was a support use case, and it was not a huge enterprise. It was a insurance company called Loop Insurance, but it was a look at how they're changing customer service with a generative AI bot, and they had some really interesting data, or some of the hard numbers were things like customer self-service rates increased by 3 times, 75% customer satisfaction rating for their AI assistant, 55% decrease in email tickets. So, but what I thought was a couple really interesting things about this company, which chose a smaller AI vendor around their service. When I was first approached by the use case, I was told no hallucinations. And, that statement kind of raises caution flags for me. I don't always like hearing that because it feels like a pretty high bar. So when he said it, I said, okay, that's fine. Let me talk with your customer then, if you're going to make that claim. And I said, and also, I don't want you to be on the phone during that call. And normally I allow vendors to sit in on those calls, but I said, not this time because you made this claim. So I want to validate it with your customer. Now, one really important thing to mention is that there is a difference, I think, in how I look at this between hallucination versus accuracy. So hallucinations I think of as really out of scope things that come into a conversation. Like, that you're like, why did the chatbot say that? Whereas accuracy is a fundamental problem of these systems because they're probabilistic. And so it's very, very hard to completely get rid of what you might call an inaccurate response. And that's due to the nature of the technology. So accuracy is really more about assessing use cases and figuring out what your accuracy tolerance level is, how you can make it as good as possible, and then what the consequences are for the inaccurate ones. And that's one reason why people are gravitating towards service as one of the use cases, because the consequences of that are not life-threatening or business-threatening. So it's a really good versus medical, where some of the consequences can be very concerning. And of course, you can then look at it in comparison, like in medical, then you would probably look at it in comparison to human error and stuff. But the fact of the matter is, we're going to have very, very low tolerance for machine error in things like medical and also self-driving, which is why self-driving has moved slowly. Well, one of the big reasons. Anyway, so in the case of the support case, it was cool because I talked with the customer and I had to walk through that conversation and I was like, any hallucinations? And I printed in the article, you can look it up on Diginomica Loop Insurance, the exact interaction. I did a verbatim thing on that, exactly what we said back and forth around that. And the customer had not had that happen. And, and when we dug into it, there were a couple things. The company involved had a very tightly controlled architecture. So in some ways, this is something of a semi-lobotomized generative AI support bot, because it's not allowed to go and do all the stuff that a chat GPT bot can do. It can only talk about your support issues. It's not going to do anything else. This particular bot knows how to escalate to humans when needed, and it's trained on really, really good support documentation. So when I asked this person, are you planning on moving this into other areas of your company? They said, yeah, maybe over time, but this is where we had really good documentation. So I thought that was really interesting. And the final point is that I really liked the talk around that there wasn't headcount reduction involved, but they had actually taken this opportunity in this company to help the support agents get a little more involved in the sales process and the upsell and stuff like this, which I think is a really missed opportunity for a lot of companies, because support agents are in a really good position a lot of times to recommend services going forward if you handle it right. And that's exactly the kind of thing you can do when you can remove some of the first level distractive support from the equation. So anyway, I thought it was a good use case. I'm sure there's more support use cases out there, but that was one that I documented. And just briefly, there's a legal documentation case on our site that I was really impressed with around helping this law firm, process a lot of tedious legal things, which seems like a simple thing, but it was a big deal for them. And then on a broader picture in the medical sector, I would really recommend people take a look at what AlphaFold has been doing. Some of the folks involved with that, I think, just won a Nobel Prize, but they built a generative AI model to predict 3D structures of biomolecules. And while there haven't been like fantastic breakthroughs yet, this has enormous impact for all kinds of treatments, molecular machines, proteins, DNA, RNA, so many things, cancer treatments, and there's been no, incredible breakthroughs yet based on AlphaFold, but a lot of practitioners and labs are using it and stuff. And I think some of the stuff in medicine, not so much diagnostic things. I'm not as excited about that because of the margins for error right now. But in terms of these massive data sets involved in genomes and advancing that kind of discussion, really cool. Oh, and AlphaFold also uses a combination of neuro AI, deep learning AI, and so-called symbolic AI, which is really interesting because that's sort of, I think, one avenue towards better quality AI going forward, but that's a different discussion. So.
I love these examples, right? One thing you mentioned, which I think is also critical, is this idea of, we have AI, we're going to reduce headcount, right? And I think that's the wrong mindset, as you brought up. I think the having effective use of AI like this support now makes your humans much more productive and can do higher level work, in this case upselling, which brings more revenue. Now it may reduce hiring, maybe future hiring, but at the same time it makes your existing team much more productive and again can do advanced work.
Yeah, it's the kind of conversations that I like to have around this, because look, some companies are going to try to use this for headcount reduction in various ways. But in general, I just don't think that's going to be a winning strategy. In some cases, the technology is just not ready for the kind of headcount reductions that executives salivate over sometimes. but also I just don't think it's going to end up being very strategic. And the good news so far is that most of the situations I'm learning about, even the early stage ones, largely feel like redeployment. I talked with a customer at a recent show that has been doing some stuff around email automation, and while it's still in a pilot phase, they do feel it's going to take off. And so in this case, these folks were involved in accounts payable stuff, and so started rotating them around in some different departments to get a feeling for some of the other processes they could get involved with, and really love that sort of concept of starting to get people thinking about that. And so, companies really have an onus, I think, upon themselves because of all the hype to make it clear what their strategy is to employees around how they do want to approach this. And, I think the companies that are more like thoughtful and vocal about how this is going to help us all serve our customers better and help your career and explain that in a little more detail, I think are going to have a lot more success than the ones where it's like, wait, what's going to happen? Like, am I going to be automated out of existence at some point? 'Cause it's a natural question to ask, and not everyone understands how this technology is evolving. And so they might think, well, you automated this today, so I'm going to be gone in 6 months because I just saw a sensational report on YouTube about and I've seen these already, like jobs apocalypse, because you can get headlines doing crap like that, So
Well, it's clickbait, right? That gets the views. So
it does, yeah. But it's not necessarily good information. So
no, and that's why in some ways I do like the branding of Copilot. It's a subtle reminder that look, it's not autopilot. They still need you humans, right? So at the same time, we were still responsible for making sure, doing the last check, reviewing the work, and before hitting send. Which unfortunately, I've seen students do this already. Homework's fully generated by ChatGPT, and they don't even look at it; they send it in.
Yeah, but even in academia, I've heard some really interesting stories. Like I've heard some anecdotes from various AI newsletters I follow. Like one of them was like a professor that challenged their students to have AI write an assignment for them, but then they were challenged to go through it and find the inaccuracies and the problems, for example. And of course, in every case, they were able to spot some problems. And so, I'm of the mindset that you have to be creative around this, because, like you said, around the regulatory environment, there will be, some regulation and stuff, but we're going to have to assume a lot of responsibility as well for how we want this to go in our personal lives, and our families, and our teams, and in our companies. And that goes for teachers too. And so teachers are going to need to figure this out, because it's not going to work to be like, don't use this. I mean, I know some universities are going to try to ban some of this stuff, but I don't think it's going to work. So I think you're going to have to figure out a more creative way of tackling the problem.
It's like banning social media, right? It's not gonna happen.
Shift Happens Podcast. Shift Happens Podcast.
Look, Jon, this has been a really, really good conversation, insightful. But before we wrap up, right, if you can leave practical words of wisdom to our listener, what steps can organizations take to build and be responsible with their AI deployments moving forward?
Yeah, well, one of the things I really like organizations to think about is this whole AI readiness concept around their whole data infrastructure and the quality of their data. And I really think getting good advice on that right now is really, really important. One of the important parts that around generative AI that we didn't talk about too much is generative AI and large language models are much, much better at dealing with unstructured documents than a typical enterprise system. And if you design some of these processes right, you can now pull in data from both your structured and your unstructured information. But the question becomes, how much cleanup do I have to do of some of this documentation? So like you said, in the case of Microsoft, for example, they're going to be able to pull all that in, but that's not always the case. And so you want to find that out. And then I think you're going to want to start thinking about, are you going to work through trusted providers or do any build your own stuff? And I would largely encourage companies to find some trusted providers, whether it's absorbing AI from your new partners or, from, really bona fide partners that have experience. I don't think there's very many companies, I would say, train your own LLM at this point and do that unless you have some very, very spectacular AI and data science teams. I would avoid that. And so stick with the companies that have worked through some of these responsible AI discussions and who can talk with you about how your customer data is going to be impacting systems, and then start working ahead. And a lot of your initial use cases are going to be very practical, almost boring, but at least you can find ones that they're going to be only a little bit boring because they're going to bring you a good savings result, right? Like reduced support volume or improved invoice processing or whatever it is. You find those and you start to build a little bit of organizational momentum. And the final thing is just that narrative. You need a narrative for how you're going to do this that resonates with your employees, your customers, and your executive leadership, but also embraces that notion that we're going to find a way to do this in a way that is safe and responsible, but also brings in the spirit of experimentation, because while you need to be a little bit conservative with your initial use cases, there's no reason why you can't start looking to create sandbox environments to get people more familiar with how to use these tools. And I know some of the vendors provide that to their employees. They provide like validated, safe bot environments to interact with bots, or start thinking about ideation around use cases, and think outside the box a little bit too, because once you start using the tools, you start thinking about, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? And so, because I do have friends who are like, God, these initial use cases are just not very imaginative. And I'm like, well, these are little building blocks to start building some momentum with some, find things that really can save a little money or time, or improve, customer relationships in some way or whatever. That's great. But then that spirit of experimentation needs to be kept alive also. And if you can do both, then I think, that's about as good as you can do right now.
That's great. I mean, for our listeners, data quality and security is important. Hit me up on LinkedIn. I think I know a company that can help you with that. But that aside, Jon, thank you so much. So if folks want to follow you, catch up with you, connect with you, where's the best place to find you?
Well, Diginomica, you can do a search for me in Jon Reed Diginomica, and you can kind of see my most recent content. And then that's got a bunch of social media icons on there. But obviously, LinkedIn's sort of become the dominant platform for a lot of this, but I'm also still on X to some extent. But anyway, you can find the icons there, and I'm happy to engage with pretty much anyone on this topic. So just feel free to reach out.
I'm more quiet on X now. I feel like it's kind of Reddit, but that's for another podcast. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Jon. Thank you, everybody. Until the next episode, have a great one.
Shift Happens Podcast.
Thanks for listening. One of the significant themes throughout the conversation is the importance of maintaining and enhancing the human element in AI implementation. Jon strongly advocates against viewing AI primarily as a tool for headcount reduction. He makes the case that this balanced approach, combined with a focus on responsible implementation and clear stakeholder communication, offers the best path forward. Until the next time.
Shift Happens Podcast. Shift Happens Podcast.